We're in our last lesson of the workbook, Joshua chapters 23 and 24. Wrapping things up in the story of Joshua. We'll get to the end of Joshua's life here, since he's been the leader and the general of the people of Israel. The book kind of follows this portion of his life anyway. So the timing is a little uncertain because we don't know exactly how old Joshua was when this started, nor exactly how many years pass, because in chapter 23, verse 1, it says, a long time afterward. We just don't have a very specific number on what that means. But this is quite possibly something like 25 years. And the reason we've got that estimate is Joshua is 110 years old when he dies at the end of the book. And these are his final words. And if he was roughly Caleb's age, then that means that in chapter 13, where it says that Joshua was old and well advanced in years, that he was roughly 85. And so this whole period of the allotment of land and the people settling after the major conflict, some time has passed here. May not be exactly 25 years. You can be plus or minus on that. He didn't have to be exactly Caleb's age. We know Caleb was 85 around that time. But regardless, some time has passed. And Joshua has some concerns as he is approaching his death. He wants to make sure that Israel will be faithful. So question number 1 is, what is Joshua's first charge to all Israel from the kind of the bulk of chapter 23 here?
See that you follow the Lord.
Yes. We've seen these sorts of admonitions before, and for good reason. That they have to remember that they need to follow the Lord. He tells them, you need to possess this land. They are possessing the land. They're in it, but there's still people they need to drive out, although Joshua almost seems to understand that they're not going to completely drive out all the inhabitants of the land. And so he tells them, don't mix with these peoples, don't be influenced by them, don't give in to their sin and their idolatry, be faithful to the Lord. There's an interesting section where he says, basically no matter how mighty your enemies are, even one man among you can drive back 1,000. As long as it's God who's fighting for you. And that's true. God has shown them repeatedly that it doesn't matter how strong the enemies are, it doesn't matter how high the walls are or how advanced their weaponry is, God can bring victory in any way that he chooses. Jericho was an example. Ai, an example. So many other cities that are mentioned only in passing that the Israelites were able to defeat because they were faithful to God. So they don't need to be afraid just because some of these peoples are pretty strong, and they are. Kathy? No?
I was reading that in Deuteronomy, I can't remember which chapter, but I would know, that the refuge, the cities of refuge, were only 3 to begin with. But because the Israelites were serving God at that time and were faithful, God actually blessed them with 3 more cities of refuge. So that's just one thing that, if they follow God, they're going to get more blessings that they don't even realize is going to happen.
Okay, very interesting. I don't remember that, but speculating a little bit off the top of my head, that could be because they have some land east of Jordan now, because we know 3 of them were east of Jordan and 3 were west. So if that's the case, that could be an interesting way that God has given them some more of these cities of refuge without the river being an obstacle there for them. The overriding concern here is be faithful to God, keep his commands, and he will bless you. And yes, you are surrounded by other nations who are larger than you. There are some powerful groups of people in pockets throughout the land that you might be afraid of, but you shouldn't be afraid of them. Because God will deliver you, God will give you victory so long as you are faithful. Then the wording that Joshua uses, where he says, if you forsake God, then these other nations will be a whip in your sides and thorns in your eyes. We usually say a thorn in your side. He says thorns in your eyes. That, I have a visceral reaction to that. That just sounds unpleasant. They need to be aware that these nations are not going to harm them and to be a problem for them because they are so strong. They're going to be a problem for them only if they forsake God. And unfortunately, when we move into the book of Judges and further on into the history of Israel, we see that, yes, these people are a thorn in the eyes of the nation of Israel. It's sad to see how much harm they cause, how much fear there is, because Israel will not be faithful to God. Anything else about Joshua's first charge to all Israel? Kathy.
I just wanted to add one more thing. First of all, that was in Deuteronomy 19, that's what I just said about the three cities
Right.
of refuge. But the other thing is, I thought to myself, I am not going to memorize all these 12 tribes and where they're at and who's in them and all that is too much.
Mm-hmm.
But then I ran across something about premillennialism, and it said that they teach that the promise to Abraham of the land fulfillment is in the future.
Right.
And not in this time. So it is really important that we know that God fulfilled all the land promise.
Yes. That is such a major theme in the book of Joshua, that God has kept his promise to the people. The only reason that they do not have all the land is because they didn't go finish taking it. But it was delivered to them, and it was theirs for the taking. A lot of ink has been spilled in service to what Kathy's talking about there, this idea that Israel has not yet achieved its full land promise. And so they make a big deal about how in the 1,000-year reign of Christ, Israel's going to become this great kingdom again and to have all the land that was promised to it. That land promise was fulfilled. All those promises made to Israel have been fulfilled. And we know from looking at our Bibles that the promise of the nation, the large population, and the land was to be in service of the third promise, which was a nation for the Messiah to come out of. And so the greatest of the promises given to Abraham was that through his seed, all the nations of the world would be blessed. That was through Jesus Christ. That's not through something that's going to happen in the future. That's through what Jesus did when he came to the world. And he came to the world as a Jew, out of this nation of Israel. So that is the fulfillment of those prophecies. And we don't need to be looking for a further fulfillment of what God told to Abraham. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I know sometimes when we go through some of these historical books, we think, well, this is about places and people and dates and things that were such a long time ago that don't have a lot to do with me. A lot of times, like, I have trouble keeping the geography straight, a timeline of things. I don't necessarily think that way. It's sometimes hard to remember, where were those borders, or how far exactly did this land stretch here and there, or what did the nation look like at this point in history versus later on when it expanded or contracted, or which event happened first in the Bible. We can get caught up in the confusion of that. But getting it straight enough to realize the theological message that has been delivered is important. That God has been faithful to Israel. That he has delivered on all his promises. We're going to see a similar kind of theme when we get into Judges, which is what we're doing next, by the way. That the message of Judges is God is faithful even when Israel is faithless. So the condition of Israel in the book of Judges is a lot worse than it is in the book of Joshua. They have their problems and there are concerns about what they will do here in the book of Joshua, but generally they are faithful to God. You can't really say that in Judges. It's more of the exception rather than the rule that they serve God. And so God being faithful to them all of those years is a major theme in Judges. I won't get too ahead of myself since we'll be talking about that soon. But yeah, these are more than just history. These are more than just irrelevant maps and dates and people. This is telling us something about God and about God's people. So what is Joshua's message to Israel in the last part of chapter 23? That's your question number 2. God keeps his promises, yes. He tells them, God has kept his promises to you. And don't take that for granted. It is human nature that just as soon as we get what has been promised to us, we seem to forget exactly how that happened. That Israel could very easily say, this is land that we conquered, that we took, that we, by our might and power obtained from the peoples who lived here. And Joshua wants them to know this is God who delivered this to you. And even more importantly, God has been faithful to them this whole time. He has kept every promise to them. Now, there's an interesting application to this, because if God has been faithful to them in all of the delivery of all these promises, then do you think God will be faithful in giving the punishment that he promises if they forsake him? Yeah, that's Joshua's message there. He's saying, okay, so you have benefited from God's consistency. You've benefited from the fact that God does what he promises. Well, look what else he promised. He promised that if you are faithless, if you forsake him, that he will destroy you. Do you really want to test him? The way of man is to say we can count on God for all the good things, but then for the promises of punishment, of consequences for sin, well, God's just too loving for that. Or God wouldn't do that to his people. That's a dangerous game to play. God shows a lot of patience toward his people over centuries to come. But they also endure a lot of pain because of their later sin, because of all the times that they forsake God. And they also eventually get stiffer consequences as they lose the land and are taken into captivity. So, yeah, Joshua is saying, don't count on God breaking his own promise and breaking his own rule that he has established. God is faithful. God is consistent. What else are you thinking about? Anything to do? Yes, Mark.
It's basically a call back to the oath that they made with God, that the amount of curses and blessings. This is something that they weren't unaware of. This is the same generation of people who promised God that they would do his will.
Right.
So this is just Joshua, making sure, doing the same thing that Moses did. I'm going to make sure that we're all clear on this oath
Yeah.
that we made with God.
Yeah, you will note that there's nothing new here, right? That there is no new revelation of something that they've never heard before. The only new thing is just further evidence that God has kept his promises. And that's something that just stacks up greater and greater over time. But the covenant is still binding to them. God's nature is still the same. He still calls them to believe and to be faithful to him. And even though they've heard all this before, Joshua's going to tell them again, because they have to be reminded. They have to all be on the same page. And so that is the long and storied tradition of God's people needing to be reminded time and time again. Why do we study and preach and read the same things that we've been studying and preaching and reading oftentimes our whole lives? Because we need it, because we have to be reminded. And the next chapter will give us a covenant renewal, which I think is a wonderful concept and something that maybe we ought to think about more often, because reaffirming their commitment to God is such an important thing that it happens multiple times, even just in the book of Joshua, where Joshua calls them to again make the choice. And think about how many times we have to again make the choice to serve God. Will you really do what you have promised to do in service to God? God stays consistent the whole time. We are the ones who fluctuate. We are the ones who are flighty and faithless. It is our job to be as faithful as God is, which I recognize as a high bar. What else in chapter 23? Okay, chapter 24, the covenant renewal. So chapter 24 may be another assembly entirely. So in chapter 23, Joshua had gathered the leaders of the people, leaders of the various tribes and priests and different people who are there to hear what he has to say. 24 starts out with that same kind of summons. So both of these are happening very close to the end of Joshua's life. So these are either two different assemblies or maybe two different meetings kind of within the same assembly, 2 different days of it maybe, as Joshua is continuing to give them these words of exhortation and calling on them to make a choice. All the same people are involved. So the same people are listed in here. So if it is a separate assembly, it is directed to the same audience. Question number 3, what is Joshua's message to Israel in chapter 24, 1 through 13?
Well, he starts out with Abraham and goes through the whole process that it's taken them to where they are.
Yeah.
And he tells them God gave them a land they didn't labor for, houses they didn't build, vineyards and olive trees that they didn't plant.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they've been given.
Yeah. Again, we're hammering on the faithfulness of God. And it's repetitive because it needs to be repetitive for them. They need to understand it. So Kay identified that Joshua goes all the way back to Abraham to give them kind of the summation of their history as a people, before they were even a people, to see how God has been faithful to them. He said that long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates. And the father of Abraham served other gods. Your ancestors served other gods. They didn't know Yahweh. And then God took Abraham and he made him these promises that I'm going to make a great nation out of your descendants. And I'm going to take you to a great land that I am promising to you today. And then, as we mentioned before, through your descendants, through this great nation, the whole world will be blessed, not just your descendants, not just the nation that comes from you, but actually the whole world will be blessed through your seed, through one descendant in particular. And so Abraham leaves his home country. He ends up in the promised land, in this land of Canaan. And gave him many offspring. Now, we know that they don't stay in the land of promise forever because Israel is having to come and to take it from other people. And we talked about this towards the beginning of the book in kind of our background. That what was it that led Israel away from this land, kind of before they were Israel, into some other land? Kathy? Yeah.
And the reason they went down in the first place is because there was a famine in the land. Yeah. And so they went down to get grain, to get food. And that's how that all started.
Right. So, Abraham was in the promised land. Jacob was in the promised land. Jacob's sons were in the promised land. But then the whole story of Joseph, how Joseph ends up in Egypt, and then he's able to see from God that this this famine is coming, and is able to save his family by bringing them to Egypt, and they've stockpiled grain for the coming famine. And this, at first, is a really good thing, that they're safely in Egypt. Joseph is quite powerful there, so they have a pretty privileged position. But there came a day when a Pharaoh arose who didn't know Joseph. As things go, as time passes, they forget the people of history. And so all of these Israelites have grown to be a pretty large number, but they're living in a land that isn't really theirs. So they become enslaved in Egypt, and they're there for like 400 years as slaves in Egypt. And that wasn't really the plan. That's a stop along the way, but that's not the ultimate goal for the nation that's supposed to come from the lineage of Abraham. They're getting to the point where their population is nation-worthy. They're more than a family, but they need to be delivered. So they're delivered, and that's how we've been going through this whole story of them needing to come and to reconquer the land that has now been inhabited by other people. Kathy?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When they went to Egypt, I believe that Abraham was still alive. Because Abraham was the father, and then he had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob. So he was just the grandfather. He wasn't even the great-grandfather yet. But my question is, was it called the Promised Land at that time?
I don't know if they used that exact term, but God told Abraham that he was going to take him to a better land away. He was to leave home, and he ended up in the land of Canaan. It was understood that this was a good land for him, and the land that God intended for him and his family to live in. The only reason that they leave is because of that famine. And that's one of the things we talked about with why these other nations have come in and inhabited it. It's gone vacant, more or less, because the people who God gave it to left. Land doesn't just stay vacant if it's good land, so other people come in, but they were very wicked people. So God was restoring the land to the people that he had promised it to, and also judging the wicked people who were living there and who weren't supposed to be. As to whether Abraham was still alive, I mentioned earlier, I don't always have a timeline of things very strongly in my head. I'm not sure if Abraham was still alive when they went into Egypt.
Because I just have never read that the Promised Land was
Yeah, we usually, when we say, go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
He was in Genesis 25. He was buried at 125 in a field of a Hittite. I don't think he made it to Egypt.
Okay, so yeah, that is before they went to Egypt for sure. Jacob was not super young by the time that all this happens with his children. Yeah.
The promised land was to them this physical thing,
Yeah.
but the true promised land is association with God, and
Right.
Jesus is the one who reveals that.
Yeah.
Ultimately. And it was promised to him, and he lived there.
Yeah.
He just didn't have a house that, he had a house, but he had to pack it up and move around.
Right.
But he inherited the promised land. It just wasn't a solid piece of ground as far as we would associate a place to live and, a permanent place. And he didn't see that come to fruition in his lifetime, but he knew it would happen. And he had faith that whatever was happening, whatever God's promise was, he was good with it. That's, I think, probably the overriding story of Abraham, is that whatever God provided for him, he thought that was what God wanted him for.
Right. Abraham was kind of semi-nomadic, and so there wasn't in like an established city or a nation the way that we would think of that. This is pretty early on in history too. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're more nomadic people, and they're living in tents and moving from place to place, but they had the great wealth of flocks and herds and servants and kind of their own mobile community, more than a family even, a mobile community, a mobile village almost, that's able to move around and to utilize this good land. I don't know that we see the wording promised land exactly that early, but God did tell Abraham, hey, pack up and leave and go to this other land that I am promising you that is a good land. And so it is something that they enjoyed before the whole Egypt episode interrupts that. So Joshua's point in telling them all this, right, is, your ancestors worshipped other gods, but then Abraham was given something good. Abraham was led out of that culture of idolatry. He was brought into the land of Canaan to enjoy that good land, to worship God, to have a relationship of faith with God. And God was good to him and good to their ancestors in general. He was good to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. They were blessed by God. Even though circumstances of life led them away from the promised land, God still protected them, even in Egypt. He delivered them through Moses. He kept them safe when other nations wanted to destroy them. As they were, right now, when Joshua is talking to them, they're a fairly seasoned army that's seen some conflict and has been able to battle. That's not how they started out, remember. They were a mass of people leaving Egypt to wander in the wilderness. They were not prepared to fight. They were not prepared to go up against mighty armies. And there were lots of people who wanted them dead, and God kind of guided them away from certain areas of people who were immediately hostile to them, and then actually gave them victory over some of those people when they couldn't go around them. And then as they invaded Canaan, God gave them victory over all these stronger people who wanted them dead. Yes.
It's interesting that he gives this constant review, that this is something that we see all through Scripture, even into the New Testament. We talk about this is what happened, this is what happened here. Because they didn't have a written text that everybody had in the house the way we do.
Right.
So they, through oral tradition, through teaching them over and over and over again, each generation reviewing this history so they wouldn't forget what had happened to them.
Yeah. Absolutely. The oral tradition of that repetition was a part of history and was an important part of making sure these things were remembered. If you didn't repeat it over and over, then it's going to be forgotten. And yes, today we've got a bunch of written documents that help preserve those things even without that, but we still recognize the importance of certain stories being repeated to us over and over. How much family lore is there that your relatives have talked about? There's some stories from my mom I have heard 100 times, and I'll probably hear 100 more times, and I'll be happy to hear it. That's family lore. A lot of that stuff isn't written down anywhere, right? But it's through the repetition of it that we learn those things, we remember those things, and that they can be passed on as well. So yeah, when writing was a hard thing to do, and you're talking about things more important than just family lore, but actually how God kept you safe, how God kept your ancestors safe and blessed them, those things needed to be repeated. So they used poems and songs and stories to repeat that over and over. Lauren?
In addition to that, is the idea, verse 1 through 13, driving home the idea of God's faithfulness here. When you get into verse 14, to me, he's really talking about the importance of how the Lord is worthy of our worship and praise and service. And he's telling them, starting with Abraham all the way, what has happened, and God has brought them through all of these things. And then saying, therefore, God is worthy of, our praise to serve him. Don't forget, like she's talking about here, the importance of reminding our children over and over, don't forget that he is worthy of that praise.
Yeah. Think about what we say when, with close friends, with family, with people who we've got a very close relationship with and who have done a lot for us over the years. If they asked you for a favor, you'd do it, right? That you would do whatever they needed because you know that they're worthy of that. We recognize when somebody has been good to us and how that we should be good to them in return. Well, elevate that, magnify that with how good God has been to them even when they were not always faithful to him, how good God has been to them for generations. He's worthy of your service and your faithfulness. Ida?
I was going to say this so reminds me of 2 Peter.
Yeah, right. This 2 Peter, written by the aging apostle, trying to remind his readers to grow in the Lord, to be faithful in the Lord. This is the aging Joshua doing basically the same thing. Grow in the Lord, be faithful in the Lord, do not forsake him. There's something about approaching the end of your life and knowing that you are approaching the end of your life that can bring some clarity to these things. But even more, I think this is about more than just, I see death on the horizon, and so I need to talk about these things. It's also that Peter and Joshua had long lives of faithfulness to God. They had a long and established history of putting God first. Doesn't mean they were perfect, doesn't mean they always did everything right, but the course of their lives was navigated in service to God. And so as they are leaving, as they can see that they are dying soon, they only want to pass on to everyone who will listen to them, this is worth it. You need to do what I did, and soon I won't be around to continue to tell you, but you need to be faithful to God. Yes.
Well, we know that in any given generation, what went the generation before can be so easily forgotten.
Oh, yeah.
Think about the stories your mother tells, when
Yeah.
unless you repeat them constantly to your own children by the time they become adults,
Right.
that is all gone. And how we see repetitively how they forgot us and forgot. So that constant reminder is, even up until where Stephen was reminding the Pharisees that whole history, and then their reaction to it because they were so far removed from it was exactly the opposite of what it should have been.
Yeah. The generational transfer of this knowledge of God and of the importance of making that commitment to God is crucial. Because as each generation passes, it's the next generation's job to hold up that banner and to pass it on to the one after that. Yeah, go ahead.
It's also stunning that it has survived,
Yeah.
because many mythologies, many histories have just gone by the wayside and nobody
Yeah.
would remember that, but this has been remembered through all that time to the testament to the
Yeah.
reality and what faith means and what, that God exists and is living and real and breathing.
Absolutely. The testament to this being passed on shows its importance, shows God's hand in it. And Joshua just sees the incredible importance of making sure that the people know you have to be faithful to God. There's, almost a little powerlessness of knowing that you're approaching death, knowing that the next time they run into a faithless moment, that he's not going to be there to guide them through it and to tell them, it's okay, be faithful to God. They're going to have to figure that out on their own. They're going to have to remember that.
Well, even at this point, he's saying, well, now go throw away your gods.
Yeah,
And it's funny because those gods are throwawayable.
yeah,
And to me, that's kind of how mythology was, something you could, it's interesting.
Yeah.
You can look at it that way. It's just interesting as part of history, but it's nothing really to be revered.
right.
And so but they still had to remind it, all right, you made this promise, now get rid of these things if you can.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of giving us some clues that all was not completely well in the nation of Israel. Still in general, they were faithful to God, but there were still gods to throw away. There were still sins to push out of their lives, and Joshua wants them to do that. Mark, do you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yeah, I saw 1 through 13 like a preamble.
Mm-hmm.
It's like saying, all of your successes are because of God.
Mm-hmm.
And now because of this, and this is what Warren was talking about, you better get rid of all your other gods.
Yeah.
And so what that signals to me is, some people had some other gods.
Right.
So there's some issues going on.
Right.
He's trying to address that. But more important to me as a Christian, what you were saying earlier, that, at this point they're about as obedient to God as they're going to get. They're not perfect. So what is it about God in Jeremiah where he says, I wish you were like these people now? And it's, if there's anything, it's that attitude of when you find sin, you get rid of it. And
Yes.
that, to me, is the big overriding message for the Christian to see in this whole gigantic story.
Right, yeah, they never achieved perfection. There's no point in the history of the people of the world that achieved that perfect faithfulness to God. But we do see a difference in people who are seeking God, who keep turning back to Him, who keep repenting, versus those who are not. Stay tuned for this morning's lesson. Let me move on here so we can get to this. Joshua's second charge to them, as we've been saying, is be faithful, put away all these other gods, and the famous verse, if it is, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He said, you have to choose. And, hey, haven't they already made that choice? Yeah, you've got to choose again. You've got to keep choosing. You have to renew that commitment to serve God and to worship Him alone. What's the people's response when Joshua tells them to choose?
They will choose God.
Yeah. Said, we won't forsake God. We will be faithful to Him. We choose Him. What's Joshua's response in return?
They wouldn't be able to stay faithful.
Yeah, he's basically saying, I don't believe you. Which, wow, that's harsh. I don't entirely believe you. And that's because Joshua can identify there are some problems in their midst. He's saying, but more than just making the blanket judgment, you're not really going to serve God. He's underlining the fact that this is not a commitment you make lightly. He's saying you are promising to obey God and be faithful to Him. But with your current level of consistency, you're not going to be successful at that. So I know you said you were going to do it. But I ask you again, are you really going to do it? Are you really going to be faithful to God?
And this part here reminds me of the passage in Matthew 6 talking about how you can't serve God and man.
Yeah.
Just trying to drive that idea home as well.
It's just repeated to them.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you guys were talking about generations. To me, with verse 14 and 15, it's the same message, through the beginning of time. And there's nothing complex or confusing about it. It's the same simple message. The charge has always been the same. And I think about that one verse, like paraphrasing, it says, like the grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word stands forever, or something like that. And the message has always been consistent and simple, and that's why it's, been here since the beginning of time.
Yeah. It's the same message, the same call to faith. Some of the covenants have changed over time, but the message of faith and loving God has not. The message of obedience and commitment has not. That's always been the case, no matter what covenant you're talking about. God has always required that of His people. And so Joshua hits them again and again by saying, you have to be sure. This is a commitment. You are vowing to serve God and God alone. And yeah, they've already made this commitment, but they've not always been particularly good at following it. And so he tells them again, you have to make the choice. And the people say, yes, we will do it. We will obey God faithfully. And so Joshua erects this great stone that is to be a memorial to this covenant renewal, to this vow. He writes the words of a law again for them. Remember that any new writing, any new copy of something written was a big deal because they couldn't just throw it into the copier. It took a lot of work, and that showed something important.
Well, you just put a big rock so they would be reminded.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think this rock might have been Jesus?
No, I think it is literally a rock here. It was common for them to make a memorial in this way, some large stone, something that was going to stay there for generations, that they could look at and see and know that whatever had happened at that occasion. We've seen that before in Joshua, making these altars or pillars or stones or memorials for them to see and to know. Just very quickly, Joshua dies. He is called the servant of the Lord, just like Moses was called the servant of the Lord at the beginning of the book. I told you the book was bookended by funerals. We started with a funeral and a time of transition. We've ended with a funeral and a time of transition. The people are faithful to God for as long as they remember Joshua, is what this says. Anyone who was alive to remember Joshua, generally speaking, remembered his faithfulness and remembered the importance of worshiping God. And then we'll get into Judges and we'll see it all go down the tubes. So thank you very much, everyone. Next week, Lord willing, we will begin Judges. The next workbook is either back there now or I'm going to go make sure it's back there now. So make sure to pick that up and be ready to start next week.